Hey, y'all, Zach McDonald, your real estate agent with Real Property Associates, and this is my Seattle housing market watch for October 21st, 2025. Well, I'm a little disappointed today because the Seattle Mariners lost last night in Game 7 of the ALCS. And if you're not a baseball fan, that means they almost made the World Series or the final championship in Major League Baseball. The last time the Mariners were in the ALCS, I was a child. And so I guess I was a little extra disappointed because every year I want to say next year's the year. And even talking with the kids, that's what we were talking about. But then we laughed that I was about their age the last time the Mariners were in the ALCS. So anyways, a little bit bittersweet, amazing year for the Mariners. And I've been talking about how excited I've been about the Mariners here recently on the channel. Huge thing for the city of Seattle as well. Can't say it's really affected the housing market at all, but I did make a video a couple weeks ago talking about how much home prices have gone up since the last time the Mariners were in the ALCS. So something you could find here on the channel. It's amazing though, just to see how much the real estate market has changed and the housing market has changed in Seattle over the last 20 plus years here. And to get more focused, every week here, we talk about the inventory coming on and off the market. And so as we're looking at the stats here for the last week, we're looking at King and Snohomish County data over the last 7 days here. And we saw what we have been seeing for the past month plus, and that's week over week, we're seeing fewer and fewer new listings coming on the market. And we saw that again here this week, 611 new listings, 663 the previous week. And this trend has been, like I said, going for a while since mid to end of September. And this is normal. We see this every single year where the amount of listings decline and the supply starts to shrink. So the amount of houses available starts to shrink. We saw the pending activity, though, keeping up almost the same amount of pending sales this week versus last week. So that's good to see. And that just means we're going to see the amount of housing start shrinking a little bit more here in the coming weeks. List price reductions are still really common. And we saw 615 this week, 611 last week. A large majority of the listings that are coming on the market, if they're not selling right away, are taking a little bit longer to sell, and they're also seeing price reductions. Some houses, as we'll see towards the end of the update, when we talk about the pending sales, are seeing multiple offers. But more often than not, houses are seeing time on the market. They're seeing a little bit of negotiation. Sometimes they're seeing a price reduction. There's also something I want to talk about briefly, and that's the canceled listings. There were 192 canceled listings over the last week in King and Snohomish County. The prior week, 215 canceled listings. And I think it's important just to note that most of the canceled listings are listings that were taken off the market, canceled just on paper, but then relisted. And so the MLS, for whatever reason, I think it's a silly rule, allows you to cancel a listing and then put the listing back on and call it a new listing if the price is 5% or more less. And I guess the idea is that you're marketing to new people. It's a fresh listing because the price was dropped so significantly. I think it's silly though, because as a buyer, if you're watching this, you might see listings that are brand new that have actually been on the market for a couple months, but they just did a big enough price drop that they were able to say it's a new listing when in fact it's really been on the market for months and nobody's wanted to buy it. And I think that it's deceptive. Let's just call it what it is. But it is allowed in the system. And so some of these canceled listings, more of them than probably not, are coming back on the market as new listings on our data as well. Enough about that. Let's talk about mortgage rates, because mortgage rates have been the talk for the last 3 years. We're still hovering right around 6.25%, but rates are down to 6.17 as of today, 10/14 on Mortgage News Daily's survey. They're highlighting that we're nearing 3-year lows, which is true and also encouraging. We've been kind of in the same range for a while now, 6.31 though last week. So a week later, we're seeing rates coming down. There's a lot of hope that we might see one more rate cut from the Fed, and we might see that mortgage rates getting closer to that 6% number, maybe even upper fives. But a lot of that has to do with the 10-year Treasury and the inflation data. Again, not as much to do with the Fed rate. There is not a direct correlation, and I don't know how many more times I could say that on this channel, but I think it's important just to keep talking about that for people that are new, so they know that the Fed rate cuts do not equal mortgage rate cuts. In fact, we've seen mortgage rates go up with Fed rate cuts in recent memory. Now for the fun stuff. We're going to talk about the pending data in King County, and then we'll talk about the pending data in Snohomish County. King County here over the last week, 1014 to 1021, has seen a median sales price of $867,495, and that is all homes that are under contract, haven't closed yet. And the average sales price based on the list price, 99%. And a quick note on that, it's important to say that a house that has had a price reduction is not affecting this number in the way it should. This is based on what the current list price is and the sales price. So if a house is on the market for a little bit, they drop their price 3% and then sell for 1% below asking price, that's 4%, right? Or more. I think the good way to look at this number is based on whatever that listing price is. If you do make an offer, this is most likely where you'd expect to be negotiating with the seller unless it's been on the market for a little bit longer time. And if we look back at the last update we did, which was last week we looked at the first 2 weeks of October all the way up to the 14th. So we looked at 10/1 to 10/14 on last week. Last week we were at 910 for the median sales price and 99% of the asking price. So pretty much the same number here with the percentage of asking price as we were seeing over the first 2 weeks of the month. Pending sales with multiple offers, also very similar, 24% for the first couple weeks of the month, 23% over the last week. The amount of escalation clauses, though, that's where the buyer is saying, hey, I'm willing to pay more than a competing offer up to X price. We saw 6% of those here last week versus 10% earlier in the month. And then the last piece of data that we always look at here are the pending sales with the contingencies, specifically financing and inspection contingency, because these are the most common. And then these are also the ones that are tracked by the MLS in the pending data category. So we had pending sales with financing addendums, 72% in King County. The beginning of the month, those first 2 weeks, 74%, so a 2% jump. Last week, we also saw a 1% jump in the inspection contingencies included, 46% versus 45% last week. Not a huge difference, right? Nothing super meaningful here, but we are, in general, seeing a little less competition than we were seeing a few weeks back, and we're seeing what I would expect to see here in the fall, which is the amount of inventory starting to shrink a little bit, as we were talking about earlier, and we're still seeing some competition on the new houses, but then we're also seeing many houses that have been on the market for a little bit where you're not seeing as many removed contingencies. The inspection addendum is always interesting to me because even with the market being as it is, there are still quite a few buyers, more than half, that are not having an inspection. Again, interesting to me, but I can understand it because a lot of sellers are paying for a pre-inspection report. And that report, some buyers choose to rely on it. They don't need to, but they do inevitably sometimes rely on that report to save themselves the money at the inspection if they feel like it's a good inspection report. And I think that's a huge reason why we're still seeing so many pending sales without inspections, even without as much competition. Let's talk about Snohomish County now too, saving the best for last, right? Snohomish County. I've actually lived in both Snohomish and King County, and I love them both for different reasons. I think the median sales price is relatively stable, $749 over the first couple weeks of the month, $729 this last week. The average percent of the asking price received last week was a huge blip when I talked about this. So the first 2 weeks of the month, 102% of asking price. So it's wild. It's like, what the heck? We hadn't seen that. We were seeing 98, 99% of asking price. All of a sudden, whoa, where'd all this competition come from? and then back down to earth, 99% over the last couple weeks. So it seems like more of a blip than a massive market shift. There's still quite a bit of competition in Snohomish County here. 18% of all the offers were multiple offer situations. So a little bit less than last week, 21% in our update last week, but still a strong amount for the fall season here. 7% had the escalation addendums. They were willing to pay over the asking price or over at least the offer price of other buyers. Last week, that number was 6%. The last stat we talk about in these updates are the contingencies. We talked about King counties. Now we're talking about Snohomish counties. 85% of all the offers had a financing addendum. 81% of all the offers at the beginning of October, first 2 weeks, had financing addendums. This past week, 45% of all the offers had the inspection addendum. And last week, or the first couple weeks of the month, 48% had the inspection addendum. Something interesting, it was my commentary on King County just being that we're seeing more of those pre-inspections, but less than half of all the buyers are having a home inspection. Same thing here in Snohomish County. It's really become a regional thing. There are fewer home inspections happening. The home inspectors tell me about it too because it affects their business, but you're also not having multiple inspections on the same house, which we were seeing a lot of before the COVID pandemic. There'd be 10 inspectors in a house. It was wild. And I'm not saying one's particularly better than the other. I do think buyers should get their own inspection if they can. I do think sellers getting a pre-inspection is also usually a good idea for them. Again, it's circumstantial, but in a lot of ways, there are benefits being able to proactively take care of some repairs so that when buyers are taking a look, they're more comfortable and confident about their purchase. And you also have the ability to price accordingly, right? Maybe there are some repairs you don't want to address, and now you can price your house with those repairs in mind instead of finding out about things after the fact. So I think there are some real benefits to the pre-inspections, but it's interesting to see it. It always blows my mind to see these numbers so low, even when it's not quite as competitive a market. Earlier today, I was part of a conversation with an agent from Austin, and they were sharing how the market there, 6 months of inventory, and even some neighborhoods with 12 months of inventory. And if you follow along with the monthly updates, last month we had about 2.5 months of supply. And that's a healthy amount of homes on the market, but we're still in a more balanced market. And even in some cases that favors sellers versus buyers, versus a market like that with 6 months of inventory, it's clearly a buyer's market in Austin and in a lot of places around the country. But a lot of the news that you'll hear about the housing market is generalized, and it's information about all the different markets in the country. Our market overall here in Seattle has been, although slower, still relatively competitive and relatively healthy through all of these ups and downs over the past couple years. So wanted to share that little thought with you here as we're wrapping up. I think that the buyers still have a lot of opportunity right now in Seattle. The market seasonally is starting to slow down. There's just a lot fewer listings, as we talked about at the beginning of the video. I think some of the data in the pending sales realm should be encouraging to buyers that they're not necessarily competing on every single house, and that there are certainly some opportunities to buy a house for less than asking price and also with better terms. That generally does disappear, though, as the amount of inventory changes in the wintertime, and we go from having a lot of options to not any options. And that's when buyers tend to be fighting over the houses and paying over asking price. Thanks so much for tuning into this week's Seattle Housing Market Watch. I know if you made it to the end that this video was valuable for you, so please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. And if there's any way that I can bring value to your situation, whether you're thinking about buying a house here in the Seattle area or selling a house here in the Seattle area, I'd love to have a conversation.